Jill Zippian. I am chairwoman of Democratic Jewish Outreach Pennsylvania, which is part of the Jewish Battleground Coalition. The Jewish Battleground Coalition is the sponsor of tonight's event, and thank you so much for joining. For those of you who are not familiar with the Jewish Battleground Coalition, it is made up of organizations in 8 states that are both Jewish and Democratic. The states include Arizona, Texas, Florida, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. So welcome to everybody from all of those states and any others who may be joining us today. Tonight, we have a wonderful opportunity to discuss the topic, can you be progressive and pro-Israel? And we have 2 fabulous speakers with us. We have Amanda Berman and we have Oren Jacobson. The event will be moderated by Brett Goldman, one of the co-founders of DJOP and on its board. I'm just going to give you a brief bio on Amanda and Oren in case you are not familiar with them. Amanda Berman, first and foremost, is from Pennsylvania, from the Main Line area, for those of you from Pennsylvania. Amanda is the founder and executive director of the Zionist Movement, where she works to empower and activate Jewish Zionists on the progressive left to stand proudly in social justice spaces as Jews and Zionists. She is also a civil rights attorney who previously worked to fight anti-Semitism. Amanda writes on Jewish and civil rights issues and is a media contributor across various mediums and outlets. Amanda graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a BA in Diplomatic History and a Master of Governmental Administration, and received her Juris Doctor from the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. Oren hails from the Chicago area, and he's one of the most trusted young Jewish leaders in the progressive movement, and is a strong, clear voice in the fight against anti-Semitism. He holds a master's in international relations from the University of Chicago, a master's in economics and policy and analysis from DePaul University, and an MBA from Regis University. He co-founded and now serves as the executive director of Men for Choice, an organization that works to activate, educate, and mobilize male allies in the fight for reproductive freedom. He launched Project Shema to help build bridges between the Jewish community and the progressive movement. And previously, Oren served as the National Chapter Development Director for the New Leaders Council. So welcome to both of you. Before I turn it over to Brett, I just want to say a few words about Brett. Our moderator, Brett Goldman, as I said, is a co-founder of DJOP and serves on its board. He's a veteran of political campaigns and has spent many years working in political affairs. For the last several years, he has worked to create global access to cannabis. In addition to DJOP, he's active in several Jewish organizations. So take it away, Brett.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Jill, and Oren, Amanda. It's great to see you guys. I wish we were able to do this in person. After 2 years, I'm super zoomed out, but here we are. I want to take a couple minutes to frame this discussion a bit because the topic is obviously very hot and everybody has opinions on it. And I know that the audience has a lot of questions, and we want to get to your questions as soon as possible. But first, just a little bit of context. Although the first person that I was ever able to vote for was a Republican, Sam Katz, who ran for mayor in Philadelphia in 2003, I've been a lifelong Democrat. I've been active in the progressive movement since college, and for the last 15 years, I've worked to get Democratic and progressive candidates elected. Sometimes that's successful and sometimes that's unsuccessful, but that's the game we're in. My experience in all of this and that of DJOP was in part shaped by lessons learned during the 2008, 2010, and 2012 elections. None of that, of course, would prepare us for what we experienced in 2016 and that election's aftermath. Like many of you, I saw the writing on the wall that anti-Semitism was rearing its ugly head once again. And of course, maybe it never left. And in the aftermath of the 2016 election, I, along with a group of like-minded peers, tried to educate our community on the unknown challenges that we knew were going to lie ahead. 5 years later, things played out, I think, even crazier than we'd ever imagined. From the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, to Jews being excluded from the DC Dyke marches, to countless acts of anti-Semitism on college campuses. And just last week, are we getting Zoom bombed? Oh, come on, Hal. What are we doing here, guys?
I can't figure out what the hell we're doing.
You got this, Jill?
Why don't you continue, Brett?
Yeah. Hal and Sue are very, very well-known activists in Philadelphia in the progressive movement. They're great. Thanks for sharing your screen, guys. And just last week, where were we? Just last week, Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, Texas. They're coming for us. So what are we doing? Where do we go? And who's going to help us? We don't have all the answers tonight, but it's my hope that this dialogue will start something for you and that we'll be able to tackle the challenges to come. So before we start, I want to start off with a quote from Barry Weiss's book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. If you haven't read it, get it. Your grandchildren are going to end up reading it. And if you saw her on Bill Maher last week, she was fantastic. A wise teacher once suggested to me that all of Jewish history, first set forth in the book of Exodus and then hammered home again after Hitler's genocide, teaches two lessons to the Jewish people. The first lesson is to survive. The second lesson is to never allow others to become slaves, because we know the bitterness of slavery, ancient and modern. It's a variation on the most famous phrase attributed to the first century sage, Rabbi Hillel. If I am not for myself, who am I? Who will be there for me? But if I am only there for myself, what am I? If not now, when? So we're going to use that as a segue into our first question for our panelists. What does it mean to be progressive, and what does it mean to be pro-Israel? I know that's a loaded question and we can probably spend 20 minutes on it, but let's go. Who's going first? Amanda, Oren?
Do you want to take progressive and I'll take pro-Israel?
Go for it.
Why don't you start and I'll jump in after.
Okay. Oren and I work together pretty closely and we've never done a panel together, so this is going to be very fun. So as our lovely hosts know, because I told them I was going to answer this question this way, and by the way, it's so great to be here with all of you. As Jill said, I'm a Philadelphia native and a very proud Philadelphian, and it's so great to be among so many friends and see so many friends on the Zoom. So I actually hate the term pro-Israel. I viscerally react to it. I think it's extremely dangerous for the goals that we share as Jewish Americans. And I think it sets up two binaries that actually really harm us in all of the, in advancing all the things we actually care about. And the reason is because when you say you're pro-Israel, what a lot of other people hear is that you're anti-Palestinian, even though, of course, that's not true. The zeitgeist is such that being pro-Israel is associated with being anti-Palestinian because it's a binary that's being set up. The other binary that's set up is that if you are pro-Israel and you are legitimately calling yourself pro-Israel, there is a legitimate pro-Israel community, then it's also totally legitimate that there's an anti-Israel community. And frankly, there's nothing legitimate about there being an international movement to delegitimize, demonize, and destroy the only Jewish state in the world. That's not normal. There's no international movement to destroy any other state. There's nothing legitimate about being anti-Israel. Now, of course, you can criticize Israel and also be pro-Israel, but being anti-Israel suggests that you don't think that that one state has the right to exist. And I don't have a solution for this, but I identify as a Zionist. And I believe that as a Jewish person who believes in the Jewish future, in Jewish security, in understanding Jewish history and the Jewish story and where we come from as Jews, as the children of Zion, that we can express our Zionism and our right to Jewish national self-determination in our indigenous homeland, in the land of Israel, without having any relationship whatsoever to the politics and policies of the state. And we can love Israel, and many of us do, and criticize it constantly and always want it to be better and fight for it to be better and be very proud Zionists without setting up any dangerous binary.
So there's the old saying that if you put 3 Jews in a room, you get 5 opinions. And unfortunately, if you put 3 progressives in a room, you'll probably also get 5 definitions of what it means to be a progressive. And Brett, you and I have some personal experience leading conversations with progressive activists across the country in which we seek to define it. So,
We do.
And we never come up with the same thing, let alone agreement in the room.
And that's how we met.
That is how we met. So what I would say to this is, I think it's helpful to think about how progressives define the problems we face. And in particular, right, progressives look at the inequities and outcome in our society, be it by race or gender or class. And the story we tell is that these problems are systemic in nature, meaning that there are things within the law and within society itself that are helping facilitate, be it racially or gender-based disparities in outcome on things like health and wealth and life. And so if you take that basic framework, what I think most progressives would argue is that we believe in the idea of creating systemic level change to ensure the expansion of both rights and opportunity in the country. That's probably the simplest way that I think I could get collective buy-in from progressives without going issue by issue through, exactly where any given progressive stands on a given piece of domestic policy.
That's a great start. So, Oren, why is it a common assertion that you can't be progressive and pro-Israel at the same time?
So I will say that I actually largely agree with the things Amanda said about that particular framing. And one of my weaknesses as a person is actually a thing that I think is necessary in this conversation, which is not relying on any one word to define any one issue. And so what I mean by that is to say, what some people are doing in this is to say, if you're progressive, which is one word to define you as a human being, and if you are pro-Israel, which is a hyphenated one word to define you as a human being, then never the twain shall meet. The reason why I fundamentally reject that entire framework is because at the end of the day, I believe that progressives have an obligation to protect marginalized communities who've been the victim of systems of oppression and forces of bigotry. And in the history of the world, the Jewish people collectively have been among the most consistently targeted groups in anywhere on earth, whether it's in the Middle East, North Africa, or Europe in particular, though we certainly have had a far better existence, especially in the last 50, 60 years in America here. And so if your argument to me is that believing that the Jewish people have the right to and the need for national self-determination in some portion of our ancestral homeland, a homeland that we were violently removed from in an act of colonization, and then forced to seek refuge throughout the continent in both Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, only to not find that refuge, and in the aftermath of endless cycles of systemic violence, trying to find a place by which we can defend ourselves and live freely and fully as ourselves. If that is not progressive, then nothing is progressive. The idea that a people who are constantly attacked shouldn't have the right to live peacefully and live freely, to have liberation, the idea that that is not progressive, to me, is just fundamentally anathema to the truest values of what it means to be a progressive.
Amanda?
What am I going to add to that? I agree. To the very kind of basic point of your question, Brett, which is why do people say you can't be a progressive and pro-Israel? I think it's cynical. I think it's mostly based on a real misunderstanding of what Israel is and what it means to Jewish people and what Zionism means to Jewish people. Nobody knows the history of Israel. Anyone who says you can't be progressive and pro-Israel, obviously is ignorant on Jewish history, on, the history of the Middle East. The line drawing in the early 20th century that created really artificial states. And and what it meant, as Oren said, to recover from the act of colonization by empire after empire for the Jewish people to be returned to our homeland and actually expel the British colonial forces. Zionism is actually the epitome, really the most successful decolonial movement in human history. And so it really, I think, for people who say you can't be pro-Israel and progressive, they don't understand what it means to be pro-Israel, just to use the term because this is the term we're using. And they certainly don't understand how, as Oren laid out so beautifully, it is truly the epitome of what progressive values are about.
Can I add a slightly more simple framework to all of this? When
Please.
people say you can't be pro-Israel and progressive, what they're saying is you are not allowed here unless you accept our framework on the question of this conflict. And in what world is it progressive to exclude people?
It's not, is it?
Well, wait, now I want to add one more thing too, which is that what they mean, we're making it very simple, what they think they're saying, what they believe it means to be pro-Israel, to go to my previous point, is they think it means that you're anti-Palestinian. And so they're saying you can't be a progressive if you don't believe in the self-determination of the Palestinian people. And it's because of these binaries that, have been set up, of course, not only by our community. I think our community is reacting to, Soviet propaganda that calls Zionism racism and really does everything it can. We can get into that later, but they're perpetuating dangerous ideas and really classical anti-Semitic tropes that are recycled throughout time in ways that they don't understand. But they think truly, when someone says that you can't be progressive and pro-Israel, most of the people who say that are coming from a genuine place. They just don't understand what they're saying. And I think it's up to all of us to be prepared to engage that and explain, not only can you actually have to be, and that being pro-Israel does not mean that you don't support or believe in the self-determination of the Palestinian people as well.
That's a great way to, it's a great summary of it. And I think, taking it to US politics for a little bit, and trigger warning, I'm going to quote Barry Weiss again. Israel did its job so well, and it did it so fast that today American Jews with scant education and little knowledge of history think it's normal for us to be so powerful. There is nothing in Jewish history that suggests this state of affairs is the norm. And there is surely nothing in Jewish history that would lead anyone to predict that the most powerful country in the world would align itself with the Jewish state. So let's talk about let's use that, and let's talk about US politics for a minute. So there's perception here that Democrats are not supportive of Israel. Oren, we've had this discussion a million times in our circles. Amanda, we had this conversation a couple months ago. Is that correct? Is that view correct? Or is it the pervasive view of elected officials, of Democrats? And if it's correct, how do we fix it? Can we fix it? I know dozens of progressive Democrats or Democrats and mainstream Democrats in general that have been to Israel and have been vilified for it. What do we do here, guys?
To call on somebody.
Oh, sorry, I didn't think we were in class. Amanda, you want to take this one, and then Oren?
Sure. So I think the answer is a clear, well, I don't know whether it was a yes or no, but the Democratic Party is not anti-Israel. The Democratic Party is pro-Israel. Both parties are pro-Israel. Israel is really the only issue in the American political paradigm that is a truly bipartisan issue. Having said that, and this really goes to the first question of what does it mean to be pro-Israel? There are different understandings in the two parties about what it means to be pro-Israel. And I think largely in the Republican Party, what it means to be pro-Israel is to basically do anything that, they think is going to make Israel stronger, to do anything really to weaponize Israel, frankly, for partisan political gain often. And I think in the Democratic Party, people often feel like to be pro-Israel, they have to kind of what's like project their own idea of what would make Israel better, more equal, more democratic, and act accordingly without actually really taking into consideration what Israelis believe about the future of Israel. And so, you know, I think, again, we have to assume that everyone is acting in good faith. I know, you know, this is an event for Democrats. I just want to say really clearly, Zioness I'm here representing a 501c3 nonpartisan organization. We're a progressive activist organization, so you can make assumptions about where people identify politically, but we don't endorse the party. But so I think what's really important to keep in mind for those of us who are engaged in Democratic Party spaces and progressive politics and social justice activism is that I think for a long time, we have taken for granted that Israel is a bipartisan issue, that people across the political spectrum overwhelmingly support Israel, understand Israel, and are deeply committed to protecting and advancing Israel as part of their commitment to America. And they really see Israel's security as part of their mandate to protect America, to protect our great ally in the Middle East. That's not a given. I don't think it's changing tomorrow, but there are dynamics that are happening that are very complicated that relate to the way we view, you know, Oren laid out really beautifully what it means to be a progressive and to see systemic inequality, to think about especially how race and class impact, you know, income gap, wealth gap, opportunity gap, educational gap, housing gap, all of these issues. And when we look at kind of the American intersectional paradigm, and we look at the way that people think about power and what it means to have power, there's often a view that, you know, white people have power and brown and Black people don't have power, and it's very simplified. And when that gets exported, when progressives who are living by that worldview export that worldview and apply it to the Middle East, they're taking an American frame, a really academic framework, and they're applying it to a land and a world that has nothing in common. So it's very easy for a lot of progressives to really simplify the conflict to see Israel. They think of American Jews as being overwhelmingly white presenting and Ashkenazi, and they think of Israelis that way as well, without really understanding that 60% of Israel are brown Jews who came from Arab lands, who were expelled violently in the 20th century. So it's very easy to think of Jews as white, privileged, powerful people, and to think of Palestinians as automatically, therefore, oppressed brown people, and to make assumptions and to say who's good and who's bad, who's right and who's wrong, based on, again, that American framework. So I think to, you know, really understand what Israel means, again, what it means to the Jewish people, what it actually looks like, how diverse it is, how, of course, it's not perfect, but it isn't the thing that people like to paint it as. We all need to be prepared to have that conversation all the time, everywhere, within our social justice spaces, with our allies and people who are potential allies in the future. We need to get people to see Israel, and we also really need ourselves to not cower in the fear of being proud of our support for Israel and our Zionism. So many Jews are afraid to stand up for that because often you're shamed for it. And so I think, you know, A, being prepared to have the conversation, and B, having the courage to do it every time you feel like you need to represent, you know, our community this way. I think that is a big way that we can make a difference.
Yeah, Brett, I don't know any other way to answer the specific question of whether or not the Democratic Party is pro or anti-Israel, other than looking at the way the members of Congress themselves vote. And I just don't see how and let's take the Iron Dome vote. Somebody in the chat.
That's my next question.
Smartly pointed out that Rand Paul has been holding up the Iron Dome supplemental funding for, I don't know, 100 days or whatever it is. But there were eight Democrats between both chambers who voted against it. And many of those Democrats had actually voted in favor of, you know, sort of the broader funding package of the MOU. So just by the sheer math of that, you're talking about, at the most, 8 people who voted against a supplemental, you know, an additional amount of funding in a party that represents, you know, whatever the math is, 267 or whatever it is, people in Congress. I just don't know how you take that math based on where we are today and say that's an anti-Israel party.
Oren, I agree with you, and I think that you explained that really well. And that's if there's one takeaway that anybody has from this, it's the point that Oren just made. And
can I just push back a tiny bit on that?
Please.
It's important to have some context. I made the same argument when people before the Iron Dome vote were saying the Democratic Party is anti-Israel. They're trying to take, Iron Dome funding out of the continuing resolution. This is a nightmare. And then I don't know how many of you actually follow, the real mechanics of legislating, but there was a very smart strategy to bring funding for Iron Dome on the House floor as an independent vote, which is as a standalone bill, which is extremely rare, hard to pull off, and it happened extremely quickly. And that's because there was a core of Democratic lawmakers who said, we want everyone to be on the record with this vote. We want people to say, do they or do they not support funding? And it, like explicitly life-saving thing. Iron Dome is not offensive in any way, it's only defensive. So while of course the vote, it was 220-9, including one Republican, it's an overwhelming show of support for Israel, but the context of it is really important. And there are conversations that are happening within the Democratic Party about conditioning aid, about, reconsidering what aid would look like, how, what a long-term MOU would look like after the Obama MOU expires. So it's not so simple as to look at the Iron Dome vote and say, there's no problem. This is not something that we need to be worried about and vigilant about. That was a great day, I think, and a point was made very powerfully that day, but I don't know that, that means that we're kind of off the hook on doing this work in the long term.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Oren.
No, I think the important clarifying point there is, if you're asking, like, is the current Democratic Party anti or pro based on the current Congress, I think the answer is pretty clear. What Amanda's pointing to is the fact that what we all know to be true is there is energy inside of the left, which, by the way, is not all part of the Democratic Party, that is growing more intense on the issue. And that can translate over time into a shift in the party. Just looking at this where we are today, I don't think you can say yes.
But if that same vote had been for something else that wasn't Iron Dome, that is purely defensive, it would not have been a 220-9 vote, is what I'm saying. It still would have been an overwhelming yes vote, but it would not have been 220-9.
Oren, any last thoughts on that point?
I mean, it's fair.
Okay.
You don't need to unpack that much further.
Moving on. So I was gonna bring up a question about on the flip side of this, that it's not to say that Republicans don't have some issues too. Look at the rhetoric coming out of members like Rand Paul and Thomas Massie of Kentucky. Do you see this becoming problematic as well? And I mean, obviously it's problematic, but where do you see this? Where do you see that going? And what do you see as the roots of that?
And you say Thomas Massie, and the only thing I can think about is his Christmas card. I've met his staff. Yeah,
it's all, they're all like that.
Yes. There's a trend inside the Republican Party that is walking away from the idea of two states. And I see that from my perspective of what I believe Israel needs to be, and in order to ensure the long-term security of the Jewish people and the project that Israel is designed to pursue as a Jewish democratic state with equal civil rights for all of its citizens. I see the idea of a one-state solution, which I don't really think is a solution, I think it's an outcome, as deeply problematic, my personal opinion, because I don't see how you maintain both a Jewish majority and a democratic state in a one-state scenario.
So we're at the half hour, and I want to continue this discussion and open it up to the audience soon. But there's an interesting thread happening in the chat, and I think it goes into the theme of the next question. Can you be critical of Israel and still be a Zionist?
Yes.
Yes.
Great.
I don't know a Jew who's not critical of Israel. And I don't know a lot of Jews, at least in my personal circle and certainly my professional circle, who are anti-Zionist. So yes, you cannot walk around Israel without hearing Israelis constantly criticize their government. Criticism of Israel is patriotic, just as criticism of America is patriotic. We want our countries to be better and stronger and more equal and more just. The idea that like anti-Zionism or anti-Israel, believing that Israel shouldn't exist or that the Jews don't have a right to self-determination is just the same thing as criticizing Israel, that to call oneself anti-Zionist is to say that you have the right to criticize Israel, is a really intentional conflation of labels that really are intended to harm the Jewish community. It's anti-Semitism. And I think what is so important about the work that Oren and I do is disentangling that, right? Saying anti-Zionism is not the same thing as criticism of Israel. Every Zionist criticizes Israel. We do it from a place of love. We do it from a place of understanding. We do it.
It's our responsibility.
It's our responsibility. And it comes from a place of wanting Israel not only to exist, but to be the ultimate illustration and embodiment of our Jewish values. That's a very different thing from saying Israel shouldn't exist because we don't like its treatment of Palestinians. And I'll, just reflect quickly on what's going on in the chat in terms of some people saying you haven't criticized Israel yet, you haven't commented on settler violence and other horrible things. And I've spent much of my day actually having conversations about settler violence, which this is not in my organizational mission or my job description, but I feel very strongly about settler violence and how horrible it is and what a stain it is on Israel and on the Jewish people. So what I want people to understand, and this is so pivotal to my work, and if there's one thing that, I hope that people will take away from this, it's that you can be a Zionist if you love the Israeli government. You could be a Zionist if you hate the Israeli government. You could be a Zionist if you are totally ambivalent to the actions of the Israeli government or the politics and policies of the state of Israel. And most importantly, although this probably doesn't apply to the people who voluntarily signed up to this call, you can be a Zionist Jew who knows nothing about the politics and policies of the Middle East, who is not reading foreign affairs every day, who knows what Zionism means for our people, for our secure future, to know that we have self-determination and sovereignty and an army to protect us in a world where anti-Semitism is rising so drastically, as Brett laid out in his introduction tonight. So being a Zionist is not about Israel at all, in a sense. It's about understanding who we are as a people, what our story is, where we came from, and where we hope to go in the future.
So that's a great transition into the next theme of this discussion is anti-Semitism. And we're at a very critical point right now where anti-Semitism has reared its ugly head. And what do people want to do about it? What does the mainstream have to say about it? What is being said? Sorry, I caught myself for a second. So, there's an often quoted statistic that says, while we, the Jews, are only 2% of the population, 58% of hate crimes, religiously based or otherwise, are against Jews. Just last week, we watched in horror as a Saturday morning Shabbat service was interrupted through what can only be described as an act of terrorism. I'm going to quote Bret Stephens' op-ed in the New York Times from last week, because I think this sums it up pretty succinctly. Anti-Semitism. You would think it could not be more obvious, as everyone from the Prime Minister of Israel to the President of the United States to the Council on American Islamic Relations agree. But first, you have to climb over a strange wall of misdirection, doubt, and obfuscation. I'm quoting. He was singularly focused on one issue, and it was not specifically related to the Jewish community, but we are continuing to work to find motive, the FBI special agent in charge said shortly after the standoff ended, presumably referring to the assailants' bid to free the imprisoned terrorist. Both the Associated Press and the BBC parroted the line with a tweet: Texas synagogue hostage standoff not related to Jewish community, FBI. The AP later deleted a tweet making similar claims, and the FBI amended its case a few days later, calling the attack a terrorism-related matter in which the Jewish community was targeted. On Thursday, the FBI director finally acknowledged that it was an anti-Semitic attack. Now let's compare that to the mountain of reporting regarding the anti-Asian hate that allegedly animated the killer in last year's attacks on Atlanta area massage parlors, or compare it with the coverage of the unquestionably racist 2015 shooting at Charleston's Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. For that matter, compare it with the naked Jew hatred that drove the killer in the 2018 synagogue massacre in Pittsburgh, which has been extensively reported and discussed. His immediate motive was opposition to immigration. In the days since the attack, the FBI's head in sand approach, along with so much of the media's strange pattern of omission, has been the chief topic of discussion in every Jewish circle to which I belong. How can it be? We ask ourselves that Jews should be victimized twice. First, by being physically targeted for being Jewish. Second, by being begrudgingly the universal recognition that we were morally targeted too. And how can that be in this era of heightened security to every kind of hatred, bias, stereotype, ism, and phobia, both conscious and unconscious? There's so much cavilling, caveating, and outright denying when it comes to calling out the bias aimed at Jews. That was the quote from Bret Stephens. That said, everyone in this Zoom is aware of the significant rise in anti-Semitism around the country. So, Oren, Amanda, what do we attribute this to? Is there one single answer to explain it all?
Number one, anti-Semitism is never going to go away. So I think we should sort of put that idea to the side. And instead, I think our goal ought to be to make sure it stays on the fringes. Whenever you've seen a society that has become destabilized by significant events, whether it's economic recession or war or plague or famine or something else, you see anti-Semitism move from the fringes into the mainstream because society is seeking easy answers to complicated problems, which always leads to scapegoating. And the Jews have made for a pretty good scapegoat for a long, long time, in large part because of how deeply ingrained anti-Jewish ideas are into the DNA of our society, especially in the Western world, but certainly not limited to the Western world. I actually think last Saturday is a really great example of one of the core problems that we face on this issue, which is that most people don't actually know what anti-Semitism is in the first place, which makes it hard for them to spot it. And if you can't spot it, you can't push back on it. And I would take one step further back and say, Brett, that most people don't actually know what it means to be a Jew. The vast majority of people, especially outside of the Jewish community, think of us as simply a religious community. In America, largely a white, and I think, Amanda, you said privileged and powerful religious community. I think that everybody on here would probably agree that whether you go to synagogue every Saturday, or only on the high holidays, or not at all, we are all part of the Jewish people, and that as a community, we've identified as much more than part of a religious group. Yes, we have a shared religion, but we have collectively identified as much more than a religious group for a long, long time. We're talking thousands and thousands of years. In fact, our religious identity comes after the identity of Jewish peoplehood. In its first place, look no further than the 12 tribes. What are the 12 tribes? That is a peoplehood construct. All of us, I think, recognize that basic framework, this idea of peoplehood. But most people from outside of our community just think of us as a religious group. Why does that matter in the context of anti-Semitism? If you think Jews are a religious community, then you think anti-Semitism is a religious bigotry, which means when a hostage taker goes to a synagogue and holds 4 Jews hostage, but then demands something totally disconnected from Judaism, you might arrive at the confusing conclusion that it's not because of anti-Semitism. I think to get to a really simple framework, modern anti-Semitism is anti-Jew, not anti-Judaism. That doesn't mean it never manifests around faith, but the hostage taker didn't go into the synagogue because he was mad about the Torah portion. The shooter at the Tree of Life wasn't worried about the Parsha. It was what Jews, the mythical Jew, the Jewish people, were supposedly responsible for doing in Tree of Life. It was that we're undermining the white race by allowing people of color into our country. And in the Texas situation, right, the assumption that Jews controlled the United States government, and therefore if he found Jews, he could free the person he wanted to free. And none of that has anything to do with our religion. Nobody understands that. And so what that means is, I'm sorry, my 11-month-old son is shouting in the background. What that means is most of our peers, even genuine actors who are allies to us, and especially when it comes to a conversation around Israel, don't even see what we see. They don't see the anti-Semitism when it's there because they're looking for the tie to Judaism. And most of the rhetoric they see, especially around questions with Israel, is totally disconnected from Judaism. And so when we say it's all about the Benjamins, it's anti-Semitic, what they say is, what does the Benjamins have to do with Judaism? And that's understandable, unfortunately.
So, Oren, how do we combat that in our progressive spaces? I mean, you and I have had numerous discussions and have seen it happen firsthand, especially within NLC over the last decade or so. Conversations flare up that are borderline anti-Semitic. So how do we deal with it?
Not just
and by the way, yeah, go on.
Not just borderline anti-Semitic. I spoke on a panel a couple months back, and the title of the panel was called Anti-Oppression, Exploring, our Shared Liberation. And there was one representative from every community, the Jewish community included. I was the second to last speaker. As soon as I got done, the next speaker started going after Zionists. So I, of course, left the panel because I'm not going to sit there and validate that type of framework. Here's the unfortunate problem we face. What I just said can't really be boiled down effectively on Twitter. And so the vast majority of the dialogue is happening in social media. I've seen some great stuff. Amanda, you can talk about sort of the tropes and slides that you put out to try to help people on social media. But to me, the only answer that I know, Brett, is people like us talking to people that we know and helping them understand, what does it mean to be a Jew? What is anti-Semitism? How does anti-Semitism work? Because without those three things in particular, most people can't understand our concerns about the state of Israel. To Amanda's point, if I started to list all the things that frustrate me about the policies of the Israeli government, some people in this place might think that I'm not sufficiently pro-Israel. But I still believe the Jewish people have the right to and the need for national self-determination on this earth. And so a lot of that is based on what I know of our history, but most people don't know that. And the only way to bridge that gap, in my opinion, could be wrong, is that conversation. And that is a large part of what I do and what an organization like Project Shema works on, which is how do we actually have this conversation in a way that can bridge through the divide and break down, in particular, what Amanda started with way back, which is sort of the binary framework that is dominating the conversation in these spaces.
Amanda, do you have anything else to add?
Oren definitely covered most of my thoughts. I'll say, and Oren probably knows I'm going to say this, it's a thing I lament a lot. I keep saying to everyone here, what I hope you'll do, what I hope you'll take away, what I hope your next steps are for taking the challenges that our community is facing and, helping solve them, is that people like Oren and I are doing everything we can to create community, to create understanding, to give language to people who get it, but don't really know how to express or articulate exactly, as Oren did, and as I tried to as well, and take it outside of our community, because we love to have these conversations among ourselves. We love to sit on Zooms and have this chat box that I have open where everyone's, airing their grievances, and we can do that with each other because, we are, as Oren said, all part of a people, and we're all really on the same page when it comes down to it. We cannot change the dynamic in the progressive movement without engaging with the progressives that don't know anything about this. And I often talk about, I often show actually a picture of a t-shirt that was sold at a conference called Netroots Nation, which is a big progressive conference that happens every 2 years pre-COVID. And there was actually one in Philadelphia the summer before COVID, so in 2019. And this is like a major conference with, every progressive activist organization, major political leaders. And they were selling a t-shirt that said resist. It's a black t-shirt with white block letters. That's it. Very simple. That says resist and lists all of the horrible things that we as progressives want to resist. So it's, resist patriarchy, homophobia, sexism, colonialism, anti-Semitism, Zionism. We are supposed to, as progressives, resist Zionism as we are supposed to resist homophobia and sexism and misogyny and racism. And so for so many progressives, that is in the air they breathe. They are associating Zionism with the worst human rights violations on the face of the earth because there is an international movement that is attempting to make progressives immediately react negatively to the idea of Zionism, not even just react negatively, react to it as if it is one of the worst things, with the worst ills in the world. And until we're out there representing Zionism, not just as a beautiful thing, not just as intrinsic to our Jewish identities, although yes, that, but also representing it as Oren so beautifully stated earlier, as part of our progressive identities, as inextricable for us, because when we're fighting for the liberation of oppressed minority communities, that includes the Jews. And when we listen to the Black community telling us what it looks like for Black liberation to succeed, when we listen to the LGBTQ community tell us what queer liberation and LGBT equality is supposed to look like, when we talk to our Indigenous friends and we learn here, our Native American friends, and we learn from them what Indigenous liberation can look like for them here, we also absolutely must fight. When we talk about women's liberation, right? We also have to talk about Jewish liberation because that is an intrinsic part of a truly progressive intersectional movement. And that has been missing. And it's because, frankly, I'm going to be really blunt about it, there have always been throughout history Jews who have whitewashed anti-Semitism, who have made it easier for anti-Semitism to proliferate in any space because there are Jews saying, oh, it's not anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionist. You don't have to listen to anyone who says that's anti-Semitism. They say, I'm anti-Zionist and I'm a Jew and I'm a proud Jew and my Jewish identity tells me to be anti-Zionist. And so for everyone else in those spaces who, as Oren said, don't know what a Jew is, probably have never met a Jew, we're only 2% of the population of this country, it's very easy to say, oh, this Jew told me that anti-Zionism is the position of the progressive Jewish community. And so anti-Zionism is literally kosher. And so until we are coming out in large numbers representing our Zionism, again, as part of our progressive identities, as intrinsic to our Jewish identities, there will be a tiny, tiny fringe part of our community claiming to speak on behalf of all of us in ways that are extremely dangerous and that are just really a continuation, a recycling of the same kind of anti-Semitism that we've seen in the past.
So Amanda, Oren, would you say that one of the main takeaways for our listeners tonight would be to show up when called?
Absolutely. That not just when called, volunteer yourself. And it's not, I want to be very clear, it's not a transactional thing. To kind of call everyone in a little bit here, I have a frustration with how many times I speak to Jewish audiences, and I inevitably get this question of, why should we show up for other communities when no one ever shows up for us? When we have always been there in the fight for justice and we don't have any allies when it comes down to it. And what I say, especially to younger audiences, well, what are you doing in the fight for racial justice? Are you pointing to your grandparents? Are you pointing to Rabbi Heschel? Is that your example of Jewish engagement on social justice? That was 60 years ago. So, when you think about, for example, if people were following or were concerned about the language relating to Israel and Zionism, what we all identify, I think, on this call as anti-Semitism within the manifesto of the Movement for Black Lives, keep in mind that the people who were there were Jews who were there helping draft that, who identified as anti-Zionist. So for those of us who really identify with the progressive movement, who understand the challenges in this country, in our current extremely toxic, hyper polarized, partisan political world, who really understand the stakes here and want to be fighting for the advancement of justice for every marginalized community, we should be there. And it shouldn't be transactional. And it shouldn't be because we want to walk away with allies. But if we are genuinely there, we will walk away with allies. So that's something to think about too.
That's a great way to leave it. I'd like, Jill, if we can open up for some questions.
So I got some questions prior to tonight, so I'm going to start with some of those. And some of them are more domestic related as it ties to this issue. One of the questions is, in Florida, there's been an attempt to pass a law that makes it illegal to teach anything that would make someone feel guilty. How does this impact both Holocaust education and our very own Jewish history? As we know, there were signs that said no Jews, no dogs. Jews were not permitted in major universities. My daughter goes to Emory, and Emory had a huge history of forcing Jews out of their dental and medical schools. There's even been a book about it. So how do laws such as this impact the Jewish community? Why don't we start with you, Oren, and then go to you, Amanda?
I was actually going to say, let's start with the lawyer.
Okay.
I talk about this a lot. I'm happy to. We can definitely both have a lot of thoughts on this. First of all, I don't think any law like this is enforceable or constitutional in any way. That's a totally separate conversation. But the context for this, the broader context for what's going on in Florida, is the conversation around critical race theory, which has really exploded, I think, in the political conversation over the last maybe 1 to 2 years, really the last year in particular. If anyone was following the Virginia governor's race, it played a major role in Glenn Youngkin's victory. And I know this is a demographic of people who probably were following that race. Critical race theory we would need, a 6-hour session to really get into that. But Oren and I often lament how messy it is, because there is truth on really both sides of this conversation, which I think maybe not everyone wants to hear. It is true that what is happening in terms of the conversation that I kind of alluded to earlier, in terms of like white and privileged versus Black and brown and oppressed, is really not an accurate representation of history in a lot of ways. And frankly, there's anti-Semitism there because Jews get wrapped up in the white, privileged, and powerful category, and therefore are really not seen as victims of anything. And so, anti-Semitism is very quickly whitewashed. So there's challenges just even in the way that critical race theory, whatever you want to call it, this new way of teaching, this anti-racism way of teaching.
I was going to call it this thing that people talk about, but don't always know what it means and how to define it.
And that's the point. No one actually really knows what it is. And critical race theory itself is a legal academic framework that is absolutely not being taught in schools, but there is some piece of it, a sort of anti-racism framework a la Ibram Kendi, that is being taught in schools. And it's not always great. And it does end up actually really particularly harming Jewish students. Having said that, of course, we need to teach the history of America, including the warts, including the horrible things, including slavery and Jim Crow. And we need to be honest with and reckon with that history if our future is going to look better. And so there are people who are, weaponizing that to say critical race theory is being taught in schools and it's always horrible because it is racist against white students. Now, again, there's a nugget of truth in that. But it's also being weaponized to say, we shouldn't teach history because people are uncomfortable or are ashamed of our history. And therefore, we don't want our students to be uncomfortable or ashamed of our history. And to go to Jill's question, There's actually a great article that when Oren starts talking, I'll look for and try to share in the chat that talks about why this is so dangerous. These anti-CRT laws that, you know, states like Texas are trying to pass are so dangerous because of what it would mean for teaching, just for example, about the history of the Jewish people. And this article in particular invokes memory laws in Poland, where Poland is not, you're not allowed to say in Poland that Poland played a role in the Holocaust. You could go to jail because Poland is trying to whitewash history because people are ashamed of the way that the Poles engaged in the extermination of the Jewish people. You can't have a better future when we say, you know, history repeats itself, or really when we say never again cannot possibly mean anything if we don't, A, document the horrible things that happen, learn from them, study them, see the signs of, you know, how a society could go into that place in the first place. And Oren talked about that already. And really be vigilant in making sure that we never get to that place again. You can't ever get there if you're not teaching the next generation about the past.
Oren, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a ton to add, but I'll buy Amanda 30 seconds to find the article, which is to say that what I would say is this. Where I get concerned is specifically the way that it turns into the, you know, can be applied to the Jewish community, is that some of these frameworks, when you apply them absolutely, lead to the dehumanization or demonization of people. Just off the bat, right? That I'm a 17-year-old white kid and therefore white Jew, white presenting Jew, and now somehow I'm responsible for the Israeli government's actions. I can't even vote in America, but I'm responsible for the Israeli government's actions. And that's the stuff that I worry about. It's not, I don't take as much stock in the entire CRT debate that's happening on as other folks. What I think is really critical to Amanda's point is we have to actually know our history, and we have to find a way to do it, to teach that history without, you know, sort of turning each person into a generalized abstract based on a set of physical characteristics.
Great. I want to turn to another quiz. Will have to be our last question because we are running out of time. If you look at the history of the Black-Jewish relationship, and you alluded to this, Amanda, that, you know, when we talk about Rabbi Herschel and Jews marching hand in hand with the Black community, you know, Holocaust survivors were out there in the marches of the 60s for civil rights. But unfortunately, in some social justice circles, there's a comparison made between Black Americans and Palestinians, and Jews and Israelis, and sometimes the American Jews are conflated with Israelis, which is a whole other discussion. But the comparison is made, and it's not a correct comparison, but that is why often kids on college campuses are booted from social justice circles and beyond that as well, because whites enslaving Blacks is compared to the treatment of Palestinians, which we know is fully incorrect. How about Oren, you address it, and then Amanda address it, because I think this is really important, especially for some of the younger people on the Zoom who have to deal with this exact issue.
So I think that it's really easy if you're experiencing, you know, if you're experiencing the story of the Israelis and the Palestinians in the way that most people do, which is to say on your cell phone, through Twitter, Instagram, social media, right? Like short bursts of information, not being in Israel, not being in the West Bank, not being in Gaza, not talking in, you know, at extended lengths with Jews or Israelis or Palestinians, to arrive at the conclusion that what is happening in Israel, in Palestine, or the occupied territories, or however you label it, is similar. And I don't begrudge my progressive peers who arrive at that conclusion based on what they see. I don't begrudge anybody who looks at Ferguson, Missouri, and then looks at images of Gaza and sees the same thing. I don't begrudge anybody who looks at the wall at the southern border and then looks at the checkpoints and the walls between the West Bank and Israel proper and sees the same thing, because I understand how they're experiencing it. And so I think that it's understandable to get to that point without necessarily holding any ill will for Jews or holding any ill will towards Israel. And I know lots of people who advocate or would use the label pro-Palestinian or advocating for Palestinian justice. And what they want is they want the end of the occupation vis-a-vis the 67 lines. They want an independent Palestinian state. They want the citizens, the non-Jewish citizens inside of the state of Israel to be free of discrimination, including those who identify as Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel. And that's what they want and advocate for. That might not be the way that we interpret their advocacy, but I know a lot of people that fit that bill. And so what I would say is, for the sake of this conversation, is while I don't think that the story fits when you get into the micro, meaning when you really dig into the details of what is happening there, why it's happening there, meaning this isn't a racial conflict over there, it's a national conflict, and it's a national conflict between two people with deep ties to the land who have suffered immense amounts of intergenerational trauma, struggling to cope with that trauma and the daily threats that they face, some of which for Israelis has nothing to do with the Palestinian people. And you can look at America and see the reflection over there, and that's a lot of what's happening, fairly or unfairly.
Oren, do you take that back? Oren, do you take that back to the binary?
Oh, absolutely.
Amanda, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I'll be slightly more aggressive on it than Oren. I think it's really important, to understand that we don't hold Americans accountable for the actions of a foreign government unless they're Jews. We don't ever say to a Chinese American woman in the reproductive justice space, what is your position on China's occupation of Tibet or imprisonment of 1 million Uyghurs? And if you don't loudly declare that China shouldn't exist, you're not allowed here to participate in the fight for reproductive freedom in this country where you live and work and vote, because that would be explicitly racist, and we would call it that, and it would never happen. But somehow American Jews, as you said, Jill, and you said often American Jews are conflated with Israelis. That is a phenomenon that only happens to American Jews, even though there are people in America who have relationships and family in countries all over the world. So that's anti-Semitism, just straight up. I think in terms of the as I said earlier, the projection of our kind of domestic racial, our understanding of racial justice and the frameworks through which we fight for racial justice in this country being exported to the Middle East is just wrong. I mean, there is no corollary to the history of America, to the enslavement here and to the history of Jim Crow and to the continuation of racist policies and voting rights issues. None of that exists in Israel. Is there oppression in Israel? Of course. Is there a conflict that could be violent? Of course. But the way the conversation manifests is so frequently anti-Semitic. And I'll give you an example of really how this conversation often unfolds. It unfolds in the context of a campaign called Deadly Exchange, which blames Israel for the death of young Black Americans here at the hands of police officers, which says basically that exchanges, that police and military exchanges between the US and Israel, what happens is that America sends police officers, the ADL, frankly, the preeminent Jewish organization, sends American police officers to Israel, where Israel trains them to shoot and kill people of color. This is what this campaign tells people to believe. And so then these American police officers come back, having been trained by the Jews to shoot and kill people of color. And then they go into the streets in Ferguson and, in the Twin Cities and anywhere else, and they just murder Black people. And of course, this is so anti-Semitic. This is a blood libel. So I want to go back, Oren mentioned all these resources that Zioness has. We have a slideshow of tropes. It's right on our website where people can familiarize themselves with the original, the classical anti-Semitic tropes, where if you hear something about Jews being bloodthirsty and murderous, you're realizing something may be wrong here. It doesn't mean necessarily that whatever you're hearing is a lie, but there may be something you should look into. If you hear something about Jews and money, Jews and power, right? Jews and global conspiracy, Jews and the media, Jews and the banks, you know, Jewish loyalty. When you hear about Jews and loyalty, as Donald Trump loves to talk about Jewish loyalty, this is anti-Semitism, straight up. And the more people who are able to identify those tropes will be able to see them in all these different contexts where they pop up, because they pop up in all different ways in every, you know, country in the world, in under every economic system and on every continent. Anti-Semitism pops up, as Oren said, as a way to scapegoat when people are looking for easy solutions. What's interesting is that it's never creative, that it always comes back to these same original tropes. And that if people were able to identify those tropes, again, going back to what Oren said about people not understanding anti-Semitism, not being able to identify it, you can't push back on it if you don't even know it's there. But if you have in your mind somewhere that there is an anti-Semitic trope that associates Jews with blood or Jews and money or Jews and power, when you hear that a deranged person went into a synagogue and held hostage a rabbi and had him call another rabbi because she worked at Central Synagogue, which was the central elite institution of the American Jewish community, that she could immediately call the president to free someone, you might think, wait, there's a Jewish power thing happening here. She thinks these Jews can accomplish this thing. So the tropes will help us look at the ways that, you know, that American Jews, frankly, are seen as the white oppressor, and therefore Israelis are seen as the white oppressor. It fundamentally misunderstands Jewish history, the identity of most Israelis who, you know, again, fled pogroms across the Arab world, you know, fled religious intolerance in the Soviet Union and Ethiopia, you know, Jews who have fled from every country in the world where they weren't welcome and created a true melting pot in Israel. If people just went there and saw that, it would be very hard for them to flatten it to the kind of black-white oppressor versus oppressed paradigm that they often do.
Right, and Amanda, that entire framework is exactly why I said where I started, which is think about everything that you just laid out that's required to see it. I have to know what Jews are, I have to know what anti-Semitism is, and I have to know the tropes. And that's just not a thing that exists for a lot of people, which is why if you're just looking through the lens that most people look, and then you look across the ocean, I think it's really easy for genuine people who don't hold ill will to look at these things and to see what's happening there. And as an example, to see, you know, what you mentioned earlier in talking out what a lot of Jewish organizations have spoken out about the, you know, this terrorist settler violence that's been going on, right? And to see that and see, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. And I think it's really easy to arrive at that place because most people don't know what it means to be a Jew. Most people don't know what anti-Semitism is. They don't know how it works. And they certainly can't identify the blood libel because they don't even know what the blood libel is in the first place.
That's all true. It's just that they wouldn't do that with any other state. That's like, ultimately, that's the difference.
No, I agree. But again, when you come to the baseline of saying this is a religious community, not a people, it becomes really easy to start to distinguish that framework.
Thank you, Oren and Amanda. To everyone on this call, please go to Zionis's or go to Oren's website. The information's been put in the chat and you can learn more about this, because we as Jews who really are progressive and want to be in social justice spaces and care about everything from the Black community to the environment to defending democracy to all these issues that we care about, we need to be able to talk about them as Jews and as Zionists, and we need to learn the language that enables us to be in those spaces. We could have been on this call another hour, but Oren has a child, and Amanda.
Oren, do you want to bring your baby out to show the group? I feel like everybody would like it.
I
Might diffuse things.
Yeah, I want to thank Brett for moderating this discussion. As we can see from the chat, you know, we have 179 Jews and, you know, 1,700 different opinions, but that's what makes us a very special people. So again, I want to thank you for being here. I do want to let you know about 2 events. Politics with Dana and Steve and DJOP will be doing a fundraiser in support of Susan Wild. You can hop on for free if you want on February 17th at 7 p.m. And for those of you on this call from other states, we're at risk of losing Susan. She's a frontline seat. And if we want to maintain control of the House, we urge you to join us in that event, even if you just come and listen to her. The Jewish Battleground Coalition has another event scheduled for March 15th with Tammy Baldwin. We're talking about the state of the legislature, whether we can hold the House and Senate, and upcoming legislation in 2022, and what holding the House and the Senate means for us as Democrats and as Jews. So we encourage you, that is a free event. Both events are actually free, although we encourage you to donate to Susan Wild. So thank you everyone for being here. A special shout out to State Senator Dalen Leach, who served as my secret moderator, who's been on the call, on the Zoom. So thank you, and thank all of you for attending and spending your evening with us when you could be in front of Netflix. So have a good evening, and hope to see you next time. Thank you, Brett, Oren, and Amanda. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jill.